5 years. That was how long the frost had been creeping across the polished floorboards. The Solari hegemony had won the war. A hollow victory. The Grendel swarm was reduced to radioactive ash blowing across dead worlds. Yet the Grand Hall of Ethelgard felt like a tomb. The High Council stood in the observation tiers, breathing shallowly, their ceremonial robes stiff with the artificial chill. Below them, Archon Valerius sat motionless on the ruined dais. He had not spoken a word of state in 60 months. The cold silence was a mourning ritual meant to last a week. He had sustained it for half a decade. His 6 eyes stared straight ahead, fixed on a future that no longer contained his twin scions. 47 star systems under their absolute control, endless fleets waiting on a single breath, yet the adamantine doors at the far end of the hall did not open. They shrieked. Metal sheared against metal as the heavy locking mechanisms were forced apart from the outside. A dozen royal guards instantly leveled kinetic rifles at the breach. The council recoiled. A human stepped through the smoking threshold. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the thermal regulator on Commander Elias Thorne's environmental suit echoed loudly, compensating for the freezing cold silence of the Ethelgard throne room. He ignored the weapons trained on his chest. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps down the central aisle. The Archon raised one lower hand. A microscopic gesture. The guards lowered their rifles. Humanity was a weak species. They were entirely new to the galactic stage. But Thorne carried a dangerous stillness. You will want to hear exactly what this human brought into that frozen room. Trust me on that. Thorne stopped at the base of the dais. He did not bow. He reached into his tactical webbing, pulled out a jagged object, and tossed it onto the silver tiles. It clattered sharply. It stopped at the Archon's feet. A collective gasp rippled through the council tiers. Solari chromatophores flashed pure white in shock. It was the obsidian compass, the royal heirloom. Scions Kalen and Alara had worn it the day their diplomatic cruiser vanished into swarm territory. Thorne tapped his wrist gauntlet. A grainy hologram flared to life in the space between them. 2 Solari youths. Emaciated, stripped of their royal silks. They were dragging massive carts under a crushing, purple-tinted artificial gravity field. They were alive. They had not burned in the cruiser explosion. They had been captured by Grendel raiders and sold to the Iron Cabal. They were currently imprisoned deep inside Void Anchor 9. The Maw. The Archon stood. His 6 hands tightened on the armrests with such force that the throne of 1,000 years finally shattered into 1,000,000 jagged shards. The temperature in the room plummeted so rapidly that frost webbed across the council members' visors. Valerius broke his 5-year silence. His voice was a tectonic rumble. He ordered the High Fleet to mobilize immediately. He would rip the Cabal fortress from orbit and burn its masters to slag. You send a fleet, they die. Thorne's voice cut through the Archon's rage. It was completely flat. He projected a second data file next to the struggling science. The Syndicate policy. The Maw was not just a mining fortress. It was a hostage engine. Thorne highlighted a blinking schematic. The collars around the scions' necks. The collars around the necks of 200 other slaves. They were rigged to an automated thermal detonation grid. The moment capital-class warp signatures breached the sector, the grid would trigger. The slaves would be decapitated before the first Solari drop pod even launched. The council erupted into frantic, hushed arguments. They were looking at an impossible equation. How could they extract the royal bloodline? A stealth ship? A diplomatic buyout? The Cabal did not negotiate. They only consumed. Thorne pulled a crumpled, forged manifest from his coat and dropped it next to the obsidian compass. No fleets, no armor, just one busted freighter and a small crew of desperate, unregistered ore traders. He was going to walk directly into the meat grinder. A week later, the rusted hull of the freighter Vagabond rattled violently against the void. The artificial gravity wells of the Maw reached out like invisible claws, grabbing the ship and dragging it toward the massive iron station. Thorne gripped the primary helm. The vibrations shook his teeth. 3 elite Solari operatives clung to the crash webbing behind him. They were stripped of their hegemony armor. They wore the stained, grease-slicked rags of deep space scavengers. Their silver skin was smeared with engine oil to hide their aristocratic radiance. The sheer density of the Cabal fortress warped the starlight outside the viewport. It looked like a rotting metal lung floating in the abyss. Proximity alarms screamed inside the cockpit. A Cabal patrol ship had locked onto their telemetry. A harsh, digitized voice cracked over the comms, demanding immediate cargo verification. Thorn's hand hovered over the transmission relay. One slipped word, one wrong code. The collar charges would blow, and the Scions would die in the dark. He keyed the mic. Back on Ethelgard, the High Council watched the live telemetry feed projected above the ruined dais. The metallic scraping of a low-caste servant's cleaning drone against the silver floorboards continued its automated path, entirely oblivious to the galactic stakes unfolding above it. Archon Valerius leaned forward, his 6 eyes locked on the flickering hologram. Through the audio relay, Thorn spoke Cabal trade dialect flawlessly. He bribed the docking overseer with fake or credits, slipping a localized electromagnetic token into the Cabal officer's palm. The vagabond's airlocks cycled open, spilling the disguised operatives into the crushing mechanical gravity wells. The council held their collective breath. If the obsidian compass survived the blast, then the Scions were... No, that was a treasonous hope. The swarm took no prisoners, and the Cabal only consumed the broken. The operatives descended deeper into the Iron Fortress. The visual feed was choked with toxic sulfur clouds and blinding arcs of industrial welding. Every shadow concealed automated plasma turrets. Every catwalk groaned under the weight of Cabal shock troops. Thorn led the squad with unnatural calm, moving in the blind spots of the station's sensory grid. He was a human pattern breaker, walking through an impossible maze by simply refusing to follow its logic. They reached the perimeter of Sector 4. The heat was absolutely suffocating. 200 emaciated figures worked the central slag pits. They were chained together, hauling monolithic crates of raw iron or toward the furnace maws. Deep in the trench, covered in ash and soot, Kalen and Alara pulled at the heavy chains. Their silver skin was dull, scarred by years of brutality. The Solari operatives moved into striking position along the upper gantry, preparing to isolate the twins and extract them before the overseers noticed. Then, Thorn keyed his external suit speakers. He did not speak. He whistled. For distinct, haunting notes pierced the industrial roar of the smelting pit. The Sunshine Lullaby. It was a secret piece of royal knowledge known only to the Archon and his children. It was the one thing the Iron Cabal could never extract or counterfeit. Down in the pit, Kalen dropped his hauling chains. Alara whipped her head toward the upper catwalks, her eyes wide. The recognition was instant. The operatives breached the trench. They dropped from the gantry, bypassing the Cabal guards in 3 silent, lethal seconds. Knives flashed in the sulfur smoke. The extraction point was suddenly secure. The lead operative immediately initiated the localized collar disarm sequence for the 2 royal Scions. Kalen violently shoved the operative's hands away. The visual feed caught the young Scion stepping backward, placing himself squarely in front of an elderly, frail slave from an unknown reptilian species. Alara flanked him, picking up a heavy plasma torch and aiming it at her own rescuers. They refused extraction. The slaves had hidden their royal identities for years. These broken people had shared their meager water rations. They had formed a living wall to take the overseer's beatings when the Scions were too weak to stand. The twins would not leave a single soul behind in the dark. The Solari High Council, bred for millennia to believe that the blood of an Archon was worth the sacrifice of 1,000 lesser worlds, watched in absolute, paradigm-shattering silence as their future emperor refused rescue to shield a broken, nameless miner. Thorn stared at the defiant Scions through his helmet visor. A slow, grim smile touched his face. He tapped his heavy wrist comms unit. He initiated a mass override on all 200 slave collars simultaneously. The primary detonation grid recognized the tampering immediately. Klaxons screamed through the fortress. Massive blast doors began slamming shut across the smelting levels. Cabal shock troops flooded the upper galleries, plasma fire raining down into the trench. Thorn shoved the lead operative toward the extraction corridor. He ordered them to take the Scions and every single refugee to the Vagabond and blow the docking clamps. He laid down a wall of suppression fire, his kinetic rifle tearing through Cabal armor. He was not going with them. Someone had to manually overload the station's primary reactor core to buy the slow, overloaded Vagabond time to clear the gravity wells. Thorn sprinted in the opposite direction, diving straight into a hail of Cabal plasma fire. His final transmission crackled through the throne room speakers. Light a candle. The telemetry feed cut to violent static. 10 minutes later, the long-range sensors on the Solari border picked up a localized supernova in Cabal territory. Void Anchor 9 ceased to exist. The Vagabond crossed into hegemony space, carrying 202 survivors. For 3 weeks, the Archon mourned the human who had burned a fortress to keep a promise. Then, a deep space scavenger crew towed a heavily scorched, drifting Cabal escape pod into the Ethelgard docks. The pod had been ejected mere seconds before the reactor detonation, shielded from the blast wave by a chunk of station debris. Thorn stepped out, exhausted, severely burned, but alive. Human resilience defied all galactic probability. 3 weeks later, the Grand Hall of Ethelgard no longer felt like a tomb. Sunlight poured over the replacement dais, warming the unarmored shoulders of the rescued slaves standing freely among the High Council. Resting in the center of the throne, fully polished and reforged, the obsidian compass caught the light. It was no longer a relic of lost royalty, but the guiding star of a liberated empire.